with the fly undone. He buttoned it rapidly. Of course. He walked back through the doors, then made his way between the handbags and the perfumes toward the menswear department with the security guard at his shoulder. I appear to have had some kind of turn. You'll have to discuss that with the manager, I'm afraid, sir. The black thoughts which had filled his mind only seconds before seemed to have occurred a very long time ago. True, he was a little unsure on his feet, the way you were after slicing your thumb with a chisel, for example, but he felt surprisingly good given the circumstances. The manager of the menswear department was standing beside a rack of slippers, with his hands crossed over his groin. "Thank you, John." The security guard gave him a deferential little nod, turned on his heels and walked away. "Now, Mr. Hall. George Hall. My apologies, Perhaps we should have a word in my office," said the manager. A woman appeared carrying George's trousers. "He left these in the changing room. His wallet's in the pocket." George pressed on. "I think I had some kind of blackout. I really didn't mean to cause any trouble." The woman cupped a hand beneath his elbow, and he slid downward and sideways onto a chair which felt more solid, more comfortable and more supportive than he remembered any chair ever feeling. Things became slightly vague for a few minutes. Then a cup of tea was placed into his hands. "Thank you," he sipped. It was not good tea, but it was hot. It was in a proper china mug, and holding it was a comfort. Perhaps we should call you a taxi. It was probably best, he thought, to head back to the village and buy the suit another day. He decided not to mention the incident to Jean. She would only want to talk about it, and this was not an appealing proposition. Instead, he told Jean that he had found nothing in Alders and would drive back into town on Monday when he did not have to share Peterborough with 40,000 other people. Then he went upstairs to the bathroom and stuck a large plaster over the lesion so that it could no longer be seen. He slept soundly for most of the night and woke only when Ronald Burrows, his long-dead geography teacher, pressed the strip of duct tape over his mouth and hammered a hole through the wall of George's chest with a long metal spike. Oddly, it was the smell which upset him most, a smell like the smell of a poorly cleaned public toilet which has recently been used by a very ill person, heady and curried, a smell, worst of all, which seemed to be coming from the wound in his own body. 6 o'clock. He slid out of bed and went downstairs. He put 2 slices of bread into the toaster and took down the espresso maker Jamie had given them for Christmas. It was a ridiculous gadget which they kept on show for diplomatic reasons, but it felt good now, filling the reservoir with water, pouring coffee into the funnel, slotting the rubber seal into place and screwing the aluminium sections together. The toast pinged up and he spread butter and marmalade on it while the coffee gargled through. He poured the coffee into a mug and took a sip. It was hair-raisingly strong. He added milk till it became the colour of dark chocolate, then sat down and started the Telegraph crossword. Nanosecond, Byzantium, quiff. Jean appeared at 7:30, wearing her purple bathrobe. Trouble sleeping? Woke up at 6. Couldn't quite manage to drift off again. I see you used Jamie's What's-It. It's rather good, actually, George replied, though in truth the caffeine had given him a hand tremor and the unpleasant sensation you had when you were waiting for bad news. Can I get you anything, or are you fully toasted? Some apple juice would be good. Thank you. Some mornings he would look at her and be mildly repulsed by this plump, aging woman with the witch hair and the wattles. Then, on mornings like this, love was perhaps the wrong word, though a couple of months back they had surprised themselves by waking up simultaneously in that hotel in Blakeney and having intercourse without even brushing their teeth. He put his arm around her hips and she idly stroked his head in the way one might stroke a dog. I forgot to say, she peeled away. Katie rang last night. They're coming for lunch. They? She and Jacob and Ray. Katy thought it would be nice to get out of London for the day. Bloody hell. That was all he needed. Jean bent into the fridge. Just try to be civil. Jean rinsed the stripy mugs and put them onto the rack. A few minutes later, George reappeared in his work clothes and headed down the garden to lay bricks in the drizzle. Secretly, she was rather proud of him. Pauline's husband started to go downhill as soon as they handed him the engraved decanter. 8 weeks later, he was in the middle of the lawn at 3 a.m. with a bottle of scotch inside him, barking like a dog. When George showed her the plans for the studio, it reminded her of Jamie's plans for that machine to catch Santa Claus. But there it was, at the far end of the lawn, foundations laid, 5 rows of bricks, window frames stacked under blue plastic sheeting. 7 or 57. They needed their projects. Bringing something dead back to the cave. You'd think they were coming back from Vietnam the way some of them talked about retirement. Not a thought for the wives. It didn't matter how much you loved someone, 35 years of the house to yourself, then you had to share it with... not a stranger exactly. She would still be able to see David. With her mornings at the primary school and her part-time job at Ardica's bookshop in town, it was simple enough to spend a few extra hours out of the house without George noticing. But it had seemed less of a deception when he was working. Now he was having lunch at home 7 days a week, and some things were far too close to one another. Luckily, he enjoyed having the place to himself, and had precious little interest in what she did when she was elsewhere, which made it easier. The guilt, or the lack of it. She was being unkind. The prospect of Katy coming to lunch, probably. Him and Ray being polite when they wanted to lock horns and grapple. She remembered being jealous of Katy when she got together with Graham. Their being friends, their being equals. George's face that supper time when they were talking about the birth. Graham using the word clitoris, and George with this forkful of gammon hovering in front of his open mouth. But that was the trouble with being friends. Graham walks out one day, leaving her to look after Jacob, which a man like George would never do. He was right about Ray, though. She wasn't looking forward to lunch any more than him. Thank God Jamie wasn't coming. One of these days he was going to call Ray Mr. Potato Head in Katy's hearing, or Ray's, and she was going to be driving someone to hospital. Half Katy's IQ, and Ray still called her a wonderful little woman. Though he did mend the fly-mow that time, which didn't endear him to George. He was solid, at least, which was what Katy needed right now, someone who knew she was special, someone with a good salary and a thick skin. Just so long as Katy didn't marry him. George poured mortar under the square of hardboard and checked it for lumps with the blade of the trowel. It was like the fear of flying. He picked up a brick, mortared the underside, laid it and shifted it gently sideways so that it sat snug against the upright spirit level. It had not bothered him in the beginning, those bumpy rides on prop planes to Parma and Lisbon. Then the plane back from Lyon in 1979 had to be de-iced 3 times, and when they boarded, something in the cloistered chemical air of the cabin itself had made his chest feel tight. But only when they were taxiing to the runway did he realize that the plane was going to suffer some catastrophic mechanical failure mid-flight, and that he was going to cartwheel earthward for several minutes inside a large steel tube, with 200 strangers who were crying and soiling themselves, then die in a tangerine fireball of twisted steel. He laid a brick at the opposite corner, then stretched a line between the tops of the 2 bricks to keep the course straight. He heard voices and looked up. Jean, Katy, and Ray were standing on the patio, like dignitaries waiting for him to dock at some foreign quay. "George?" "Coming." He removed the excess mortar from around the newly laid brick, scraped the remainder back into the bucket and replaced the lid. He stood up and walked down the lawn, cleaning his hands on a rag. "Katie has some news," said Jean.